This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. I'm Tia, your host for this special edition minisode. We asked our amazing listeners to make donations in support of the protests calling for racial justice, and a huge thanks to Simon Domini Lytle for commissioning this minisode. I'm joined by Nick White today to talk about religion in comics. How are you doing, Nick?
Pretty good. Yeah, I think they put me on this episode because I ended up somewhat not with the full intent of originally getting one, but getting a religion degree during college. So I suppose that makes me ever so slightly qualified to maybe talk on these things, although we'll see, right?
I had no idea that you had a religion degree.
Yeah. I was originally an English major. And having attended a liberal arts school, you have to take a little bit of everything. There's no way they're not going to let you out, whether you want to take everything or not. And I took a couple religion courses, found it really interesting, just ended up taking a couple more. And next thing I know, I'm a double major. So, yeah.
And what was your area of focus in religion?
Sure. So a lot of what I was doing for my first couple years was really, unsurprisingly, given my background, given where I lived, very, Christianity theologically oriented. And then sort of as I kind of combined my two majors for my last 2 years, I was really doing a lot of the interactions between literature and religion, and then also on a broader scale, pop culture and religion, and how the two sort of simultaneously borrow from each other and yet demonize. Excuse me. Try that again. Sort of how religion and pop culture simultaneously demonize one another and yet also borrow the best bits from one another to further their own ideology. So, yeah.
Okay, well, that definitely explains why you got tagged into this episode.
I suppose so, yeah.
I assume I was tagged in because I have read every issue of The Wicked and the Divine 10 times.
And that's pretty much the secondary, qualifying, criteria. First it's formalized degree, and then it's, how many issues have you, you must have read this many issues of The Wicked and Divine to speak on this topic. So, yeah.
I remember when I was reading it the first time as it came out, and it was still Gods as Pop Stars. That was the kind of very brief, high level description of it. And people were trying to figure out, what do the gods sound like? What does their music sound like? And eventually, as we started to see more of the gods' performances in the comic, it was they're not singing. It's not like a concert. It's these different religious gatherings, these different religious experiences, and some of them are more interactive with the audience and others are more solitary or singular. And so I think that the medium of comic books is a graphic medium, since you couldn't really convey an auditory experience in a one-to-one way in any case.
Right. I mean, comics have tried and failed for years. Yes.
Yeah. So I thought that it was really interesting to see kind of graphically how these religious experiences were conveyed in the different, I guess, religious genres that each of the gods represented. I don't know if have you read The Wicked and the Divine yet?
I actually haven't, and I think I've debated reading it a couple times, but a couple times the series wasn't completely done yet, and I was well, I'm just going to wait until it's all done. And I think that resulted in more than a couple moments while it was ongoing where people would be oh, can you believe blah, blah, blah happened? And I would just cover my ears and I'd be don't say anything. I know this book is twists and turns and revelations, so don't reveal anything because I don't want to have it spoiled. So I have remained willfully and totally, utterly ignorant of virtually everything that book has to offer aside from like the core conceit. Like that is it. I know some characters shockingly died at moments, and I do not even know who they are or what happened, and that is where it stands.
So what are some comics that have religion as a major theme that are some of your favorites?
Right. So you already brought up one of them, and that's Hellboy. It's definitely Hellboy. And I'm not saying that like I need to spend 98% of my time on Wikipedia, but like anything that has me going to Wikipedia on some level, like if there's a deep dive involved while I'm reading, like I always find that sort of interesting. And with Hellboy, there's always this constant discussion of, religious figures, religious legends, non-canonical religious texts. And so much of the time with Hellboy, I'm just having to go on Google with the just big question of, is this a real thing, right? Like, are we talking about something real, or was this made up for the book? And what's so rewarding about Hellboy is that a lot of the time it's referencing real things.
How do you feel about the way Hellboy kind of conflates those religious things with other supernatural folklore, like fairies, or I don't know, there's like some Japanese folklore stories that I really love. There's a lot of like British Isles folklore and ghost stories and things
sure.
like that.
All kinds of Arthurian legends. Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So how do you feel about that conflation?
Right. Like, certainly it's not something where I think maybe this is fun for someone else, but like if you want to like try to parse this down, right, and make this all line up or sort out on like a theological level, or be like, well, what sort of canon is Mike Mignola trying to make here? I think things obviously start to like, especially because there's a lot there that's relating to Christianity. And so if you take that and then you try to put that alongside some of the other things there, it can kind of be like, well, this maybe shouldn't really, gel with, X really shouldn't gel with Y. But, if that's your level of like having fun when you're reading, then I guess have at it. For me, I try to not, make it all work, right? Like, I think that's part of the fun of the book, is that Mike Mignola isn't utterly concerned with, I guess you would say, following the hard constraints of what should and shouldn't and hasn't been, dictated as accepted by, conventional theology.
Well, so many stories from Christianity are sort of mapped onto pagan stories, pagan religious beliefs. So I guess in a way it makes sense that, if you look at archetypes of stories, regardless of the iconography in them, like the archetypes are pretty similar. And especially the ones with a lot of crossover, I imagine function as a sort of shorthand. Like a lot of people will be familiar with them. And so as a creator, you don't have to do a lot of explaining, maybe if you're using these really widely known, familiar myths and stories and religious parables and things. And you can kind of push them a little bit further in your own mythology, because you're already starting from a point where a lot of your audience is going to have some point of entry into them from somewhere. So
right, yeah, absolutely. Like what Mike Mignola is doing in terms of the creative liberties he's taking is nothing new, right? This isn't something that's like super edgy or whatnot. This is what he's doing by sort of associating these things with one another is not, it's not new. Creative individuals have been doing this forever now. So,
and it seems like a major theme of Hellboy is just the concept of like nature versus nurture and goodness, right? like I think that religion in general is very preoccupied with those questions. So it just seems like a really fruitful framework to put Hellboy, who, you know, I'm not going to sit here and make comparisons to Hellboy and any other religious figures because I don't want to offend anybody. But I think it's an interesting sort of way to come at the idea of a reluctant hero when you have the background of Christianity or any of these other myths and legends, and you have this like really likable character who in many ways is very human, and we can all really relate to that struggle. But then it also plays out in the very like grand and crashing way that religion can sometimes have, like the Baroque sense of good and evil.
Yeah, absolutely. I would completely agree with all of that. Yeah, Hellboy for me is definitely probably one of the main ones that I look at, and there's a lot to sort of parse there. And as I said, like any book that immediately has me like going on Wikipedia to research more, like I always sort of, those are kind of the titles that I kind of pay attention to and go, oh, you know, this is something that's driving me outside of the text itself to learn more or investigate more. So
the Thor comics are fun in that way too.
Thor I haven't read much of, but I find Thor interesting, and certainly so have a lot of other like I guess I shouldn't say so have. I don't consider myself a religious scholar, but other religious scholars have certainly found Thor interesting because there you kind of have this moment of, if someone who's a deity, injected themselves into our everyday lives, how would that impact? What are the implications of modern religion were that to happen, right? And I haven't read enough Thor to really know how they handle this. I think they obviously have found ways to kind of dance around the idea of, hey, if this, religious figure, which was largely being worshipped X amount of years ago, suddenly became real, what are the implications of that for, modern religion and how that would shape things, right? It almost becomes kind of a thought exercise that I think the comics are understandably not interested in having, right? Like,
I don't know. I think that especially the like 60s Thor comics, where the genre bending is really happening, like they're like mythology and fantasy in a way, but they're also sci-fi and like outer spacey. I think that speaks to a really neat moment in the 60s where sci-fi and religion were getting really entwined, or were
sure.
like continuing to be entwined. Like I'm thinking about, of course, like the following in the tradition of like earlier writers like L. Ron Hubbard and stuff like that. So just a moment of in time of like religion and sci-fi being twisted around each other, I think you can see in the Thor comics in a really interesting way that I don't see in, for example, Wonder Woman, but I do see in like New Gods. So I don't know, is that, I mean, I guess maybe that's a Jack Kirby thing.
I think you hit the nail right on the head. Like, I think that it's exactly, I would say that's certainly like, that's a Jack Kirby thing. That's something he's interested in discussing and exploring, and maybe not as much all of his contemporaries, but
that seems like a good segue to what you were saying when we were talking before the show about sort of like comics as religion. I feel like a lot of people deify Jack Kirby.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. I think that's that would, yeah, if there was sort of a deification process or sanctification process, I think Kirby would probably have to be at the top.
And more so than a figure like Stan Lee. And I think the reason for that is because I think people see Stan Lee as someone who got a lot of credit for the contributions that he made. Whereas I think people like to think of Jack Kirby as this like unsung hero, which is a bit silly because obviously he is a sung hero, if that is the term. But
no, I think you're completely right. Yeah.
It's there's this sense of sacrifice, of Jack Kirby sacrifice that people, I think, love to add to his mythos.
Yeah, and if you look at Kirby's arc, so to speak, I think you're dealing with someone who, found himself being continually, persecuted and screwed over by all of these different companies. And, it's not, I don't think one can say that Kirby was someone who, had to lead the life of, an ascetic, right? And was poor and whatnot. But you certainly, I think, have someone who kind of was taken advantage of by the system. And so I think it's easier to relate with someone like Kirby than it is to relate with someone like Stan Lee. And I don't want to get on the whole, anti-Stan Lee bandwagon, but it's not news to anyone to hear that, of course, Stan Lee probably gained the most while potentially maybe not doing as much as everybody else. And so I think he's a hard figure for people to connect with on that level. So, yeah. No, I think you can, if you look at comics as sort of its own religion, and you look at rituals such as attending conventions or going to your comic book store, absolutely. These are institutionalized, quote unquote, ceremonies that have specified dates and times and yes,
the sort of fetishization of of the comics themselves as totems, or like
you bag them, you board them, maybe you put them in 5 inches of Mylar and they go behind a glass case and they hang in your special, in your special room. And yes, I understand some people are probably going to be a little uncomfortable likening religion or likening being a fan of comics and everything that comes with that to religion. But I think if you look at sort of modern day pop culture fandom and the things that propel it, it's really not that different. Again, I know some people are going to not appreciate that similarity being drawn, but especially these days, I think it's harder and harder to ignore it.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, they're all stories, and the level of belief that you put into the stories, like there's a spectrum, right? Where some people fall more on the literal side of it and some people are a little more on the abstract side of it. But I think that it's still stories that more or less trade in the idea of good and evil and right and wrong, how to coexist with each other, how to handle adversity, etc. So, like human stories, I think all have those same themes, and certainly religion is created through stories as well.
I mean, one of the things I always think of that kind of, I think, is a perfect reflection of this level of fandom and obsession and sort of how people are using it to sort of guide and orient their own lives is the fact that I think a couple years ago, the UK released, the percentages of what religions people had identified with. And I think like 2% of individuals had put Jedi Knight, right?
Yeah.
And I think that sort of kind of sums up the power that these different fandoms, especially now in this day and age of internet, where the ability to sort of interact with and relate with people with similar interests and beliefs is on such a grand scale. Just the power that these fandoms can have, and comics are no different, and especially now that they're on the big screen so much, I think that it's only, you know, becoming a bigger and bigger thing. So
that's a whole other, like, you know, sort of not religious practice, but it kind of parallels religious practice that we, you know, like the going to conventions, like Wednesday New Comic Book Day rituals, like the ritual of going to these big superhero movies and having a shared experience with the audience, you know, the other members of the audience.
oh sure, absolutely.
Which
And
this all
I
goes.
think go ahead.
Oh, this is like a really kind of symmetrical place to end up in this conversation, because that's kind of what The Wicked and the Divine is all about, really, is like art as religion, and the shared experience of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, again, I've only seen occasional pictures of The Wicked and Divine, but yeah, I think I can relate to that for sure. Um, Another sort of interesting thing for me, kind of maybe worth discussing a little bit, is sort of kind of thinking about, you know, obviously art is such a, and this is obviously a huge, massive rabbit hole to fall down for a small show, but I think it's at least worth mentioning that the connection between just the visual element of art and the visual element of comics is something that, the visual element of comics and the visual elements in religion have sort of interesting parallels that have gone back, you know, how many years now, right?
Oh,
Because
if you look at the Parthenon marbles, or, you know, maybe even the cave paintings in like Lascaux, which
right.
we don't really know what they were, but a lot of people theorize they were religious in some way. Medieval art especially is almost like one-to-one. If you have comics visual literacy, you can bring that to read religious art from the medieval period, where it literally is like a comic book, and you see the same figures appear multiple times in the panel. And if you look closely, you understand that it's like, because it's showing you the passage of time, which is what comics do. So there definitely is a connection there.
Right. And we're talking about sort of a conveying of narratives and stories and mythology, for starters, at points that predate written language, you know, beyond anything else. And then I think people sort of forget that sort of artistic depictions of narratives, be they religious or not, were so important at times where the vast majority of the population, either there wasn't a written language or the vast majority of the population were illiterate. And so things like stained glass, you know, windows were so important, because now you had this ability to convey a narrative, again, be it religious or not, but we are talking about religion, the ability to convey a narrative without text, because either people couldn't read or they couldn't afford a Bible because it had to be written by hand. So,
and
yeah.
you know, there are comics today that are, I guess, that tell religious stories, not in an oblique way or in a kind of like abstract way, like a lot of the books we've been talking about. But like, for example, Graphic India is a pretty interesting. They do animated series and comics as well, and some of them are like use like really literal religious characters. So, you know, the connection is still very close, even in like what I would say are quote unquote mainstream comics.
Yeah, I think you were sort of referencing Grant Morrison's 18 Days.
Well, the whole Graphic India as a publisher has a lot of titles, but yeah, that's one of them for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any other texts that you've read that you would point to and say maybe this is either sort of an overt depiction of modern day religion in comics, or a more subtle one, or kind of something that sort of dances around it, or even, and I think we've only touched on this a little, but obviously there are plenty of comic books out there that deal with created religions that are just created for the text itself. So those exist too, obviously. So
yeah, why don't we wrap it up with each giving our recommendation for our favorite comic book title that in some way touches on religion?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I will try to narrow it down to one. I might have to give maybe a couple, but it won't be a real deep dive. So, do you want me to go first, or should you?
I'm going to go first, and I would like you to use that time to pick one. I'm gonna really make it hard on you because I know you, Nick.
I was going to say, what is my core trait? It's indecision. So go ahead.
Choose one. Of course, obviously, The Wicked and the Divine, I think as an art historian, like art and religion, art as religion to me is just such a touchstone of my thinking about everything in the world. So that I think that book just beautifully portrays many facets of art as religion. And I recommend it for that reason, and as well as a number of other reasons. It's a wonderful book, but on this particular topic, I think it's really, really well done.
Yeah, well, I guess for me, probably it would still have to be Hellboy. I like Hellblazer, but because it went through so many... Yeah, I know. Well, I'm just qualifying this. Hellblazer has had so many different creative teams. Like, the book went on for like 20 years. So I think overall it's hard for me to say Hellblazer. I think it would have to be Hellboy. And I think that's largely because Mike Mignola really never gave up never let anybody else sit in the driver's seat. So there's that consistency there. So
Nick's recommendation is Hellblazer Boy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if I could pick specific arcs of Hellblazer, that would be easier, but we don't have the time, this is neither the time nor the place for that sort of deep dive. So I would say Hellboy.
It's a good one.
Just the consistency and such an interesting look at, as you yourself said, it's sort of a little bit of understood theology that I think most people can sort of come in and say, oh, I can relate to these elements, but then it broadens and explores so many other elements of so many other religious legends and myths and narratives that you find yourself engaged, but also informed. I think there's so much to look at there. So.
Well, it sounds like we could talk about this for a while, so maybe we'll recommend it to the man up in charge of the show for a full topic one of these days, and talk more about religion and comics. I think we're out of tape for today. So I will say again, Simon, thank you so much for your donation. This was a really cool idea for a show. And Nick, thank you so much for taking the time to come and chat.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here.